Mussolini capitalized on a deep-seated frustration among Italians. Italy was still a young nation, having only united in 1871. The surge of nationalism that came with unification left Italians hungry for greatness, but feeling disappointed. Its parliamentary democracy was weak and ineffectual, and the economy was terrible. And, as with Germany, the Italians had just suffered through World War I, and people were angry about the way it was fought and the way it was finished.
Piazza Venezia became the stage for a new, amped-up kind of nationalism. Mussolini loved big rallies, and from his balcony, offering big promises and simple solutions to complex problems, he whipped his followers into a mass frenzy.
È già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori.
They interrupted his speeches with chants of Duce, 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 leader.
What I understand now is that it was like a collective dream. It was like hypnosis. Standing in a crowd with thousands of people all focused on one man who was terrific at using his body, his facial expressions and language to reach their hearts.
Aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
They were going ballistic, even for a hand gesture or a facial expression of Mussolini. Mussolini was an actor, and when he eventually showed up in that window, and he stood in his typical posture with his imposing chin, for the Italians, he was the personification of a greater Italy.
He promised an Italy that would be great, that would be modern, that would be finally unified, where there would be work for everybody.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. With the first presidential debate on June 27th, the 2024 presidential campaign inexorably presses forward to its November conclusion. As worries about the real possibility of another Trump presidency mount, more and more people see that possibility as an existential threat to our democracy and the world's survival. Since August of 2023, a number of conservative organizations have been drawing up plans that would dismantle the federal government and civil service and replace it with a vision closer to Trump's own. Opponents of his are involved in taking extraordinary preemptive actions to form an emerging coalition, drafting potential lawsuits if he uses the Justice Department to take revenge on his adversaries or sends federal troops into democratic cities to carry out mass deportations, or build huge camps to hold immigrant detainees, or make it easier to fire huge numbers of servants, of civil servants, and replace them with loyalists. He's vowed to do this and more, over and over and over again. Our guest today, Bandy Lee, on the Radical Imagination, has been talking about this for years, from the very beginning of the Trump administration. She's talked about this political anxiety and psychic agitation. She first organized a 2017 conference at Yale on the mental health of Donald Trump with the participation of other psychiatrists. Later in the year, she edited The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, a collection of essays warning about the dangers of his mental instability, and it became a New York bestseller. Bandy Lee is a renowned forensic psychiatrist whose scholarly work includes the writing of a comprehensive text on violence. She's been Harvard and Yale educated. She's also a specialist in public health approaches to violence prevention and has been a consultant with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and initiated numerous reforms at New York Rikers Island Correctional Facility, as well as prisons in 5 other U.S. states. She has a brand new book, The Psychology of Donald Trump and Contagion, an existential threat to American democracy and all humankind, in which he discusses the consequences of having a severely mentally impaired person in a position of great authority, which can lead to contagions of criminality, a publicly shared psychosis that could lead to a society's self-suicide. The latter part of the book discusses the larger context that has given rise to his presidency and offers cures and solutions to this profoundly dangerous public health problem. It's been reported that the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly secretly consulted the dangerous case of Donald Trump as a guide, as a manual for dealing with Trump. It enabled him to intervene and block Trump from ordering the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. Let's hope we never have to reach another moment again, which then Bandy's new book will have to serve as a similar function. So let's say an amen to that. We're very anxious to talk about your book, but hopefully,
I think you summarized it right there.
Well, there you go. And it took a lot of courage and backbone and integrity, and we just are so graciously thankful for your efforts here, because we need people like you very, very much. People are not being forward and direct and waffling here and there, and you just come out, as we need to here as a country to sustain ourselves as a country, as a culture, as a democracy. Some of the ideas and some of the points that you're bringing out. So give us an idea about this new book, Social Contagion. It's a very interesting concept. Sociologists talk about it. A shared social psychosis. Help us understand that a little better.
Yes. First, allow me to acknowledge you, Jim, for seeing me through this whole period throughout the Trump presidency and all our struggles through it. It really is a time when we need radical imagination to be able to conceive of a different world and truly to intervene in ways that will make a difference and allow for that imagination to unfold.
Well, as I told you again and again, Bandy, I'm in this for the long haul. I know you are. So we're going to be imagining ways to counteract, resist, and make that world happen. I know we will.
Yes. Well, you and I see that potential. And I guess one of the great discoveries I've had in practicing psychiatry is just what tremendous human potential we all have, and freeing that, allowing that to express itself has been my professional goal, if you will. And so for me, speaking up about Donald Trump was just a natural consequence of the field in which I've been trained. Of course, it's never always that way, but with this particular presidency that he held had much to do with psychiatry, which was why I dropped everything in my usual academic and clinical career to be able to speak up about the dangers that he posed. Unfortunately, we were silenced very early on. In the beginning, we were quite successful. We came out with a conference at Yale, as you described, and then which led to an unexpected best-selling New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president, which was so unexpected as a bestseller that one of the big 5 publishers kept printing, and it took them 5 weeks to catch up with the demand. And then shortly thereafter, we were consulting with Congress members. We met with over 50 of them, and we were the #1 topic of national conversation. The Congress members themselves told us that they depended on us to educate the public medically so that they could intervene politically. Because without that medical education for this incredibly unusual situation, they would not be able to intervene. But of course, we know what happened after that. The American Psychiatric Association intervened extremely aggressively, unlike anything it had done in the past, using very unprofessional language and, in fact, slandering and defaming us. And within 2 or 3 weeks, we were blacked out of the major media. And all that we were concerned about, that the psychological dangers would become social, cultural, geopolitical, and civic dangers, has come to pass. And that's why I'm coming out with my new book, speaking of how this has happened and the phenomenon we're observing, which I'm calling Trump Contagion. But it really is, as you've described, a social contagion, an emotional, behavioral, and ideological contagion that we see all the more so if negative emotions are being transmitted. Of course, positive emotions can be contagious too, but those are much more rational and persuasive on their own. Negative emotion or sensationalism, and all the more so mental symptoms, are contagious. We don't normally think of mental symptoms as contagious, but in fact, they perhaps are even more contagious because we don't require physical exposure to be able to for the symptoms to transmit, but need only emotional bonds. And with the mass media, social media environment we are in, definitely we have seen it go viral.
So again, the question becomes, when you talk about a shared psychosis, you're talking about not catching some sort of, it's not like a Lyme's disease, you get a little bug or something, but through the media and through watching and listening to this individual, Donald Trump taps into one's own anger and hostility and venom, and somehow it resonates in a way so they begin to identify with his struggle as theirs, and they're all on board for whatever the heck he says they should do. Is that sort of getting there a little bit to understanding?
Yes, certainly. There is that component. In fact, the spread of mental symptoms is very similar to the spread of other infectious diseases in that you need 3 components. You need an offending agent, which is usually a virus or a germ in the case of physical illnesses, but in this case, it's a person. And then you need weakened hosts. In other words, those who are usually immunocompromised are the first to be infected. In the case of psychological contagion, it's more a weakened emotional state of mind or a predisposition. And then you need a facilitating environment in that certain conditions, such as lack of ventilation or clean water, may happen in the case of physical infectious diseases. For social contagion, you need a kind of, the media environment that we have that actually facilitates the spread of conspiracy theories, of delusions, of disinformation, and propaganda systems, as well as a very psychologically weakening environment of socioeconomic inequality. Now, I describe how that exactly plays a role psychologically in my previous book, Profile of a Nation, Trump's Mind, America's Soul.
But before you finish your statement, let me just say, if you had a more effectual, if you will, if you want to use psychological, healthier administration that was truly able to satisfactorily channel people's anxiety and energy politically, economically, better than let's say the Biden administration has been able to do, you not have a turn to Trump as a solution, or what do you make of that?
Yes, absolutely. The reason why someone like Donald Trump could rise politically in the first place is because we have had a very um, sickening environment in terms of our collective mental health. If we had a much more health affirming socioeconomic environment where there is not the kind of inequality, extreme wealth and income inequalities that we're seeing right now, which, as you know, I call structural violence. So structural violence is an extreme, a potent instigator of all forms of other violence, including behavioral violence. And so the very fact that someone with a violent and aggressive psychology would be attractive to the public came about because of the proneness to violence that other people held as a result of the discontent and the hierarchical systems in our minds that socioeconomic inequality creates. Of course, there's also racism and sexism that have played a role. But all these together consist of the facilitating environment I was speaking about. So among the three components, the major one and the fundamental one would be the facilitating environment, which then give rise to weakened hosts, or it's shared psychosis. It's been studied for 150 years or so. So it's, one category is those who have the same psychology as the offending agent, in this case, Donald Trump, and others have a predisposing psychology, say.
Who do you identify in that first category there?
So others with his same condition. So we don't really know what his conditions are without doing a full diagnostic assessment that includes his medical records and tests and things like that. So we won't give a diagnosis, but we can be pretty sure that his severe symptoms indicate at least a half dozen to a dozen psychiatric disorders.
Wow.
And so
I'm sorry, I just want to understand the first. So his most fervent supporters that actually go out in the street and perhaps even try to create violence in the Capitol and so on, that would be maybe the first group there, that the real true believers that are willing to put themselves on the line in a way that others may not.
That's right. Those who would succumb first to this overall condition of shared psychosis. By the way, let me clarify that shared psychosis does not mean each and every individual will have a psychosis. It means that the entire group as a whole will act as if it had psychosis.
Right. There'll be individual variations within the group. But I think it's very important to make this, as Jim Gilligan does.
So it's actually more a collective condition.
Collective
condition that comes about because of the widespread contagion of symptoms. Now, we can think of it in terms of a pandemic. When we call something a pandemic, it's not an individual diagnosis, it's a social condition. So among the individuals who would be weakened and therefore succumb more quickly would be those who share his disorders. Others would be those who are predisposed, either personality-wise or in other ways, predisposed to having his symptoms, who then come to full-blown being symptomatic with the shared psychosis. And the third category is people who resist for a very long time and in the end finally succumb because of the pressures, the emotional pressures and social pressures and so on. Those are actually the hardest to treat. And the fourth category are the healthy individuals, the previously healthy ones who then succumb to a psychosis, to the shared psychosis. And those are situations where, as you can see, this is a condition, a social condition where everyone is vulnerable to it, given enough pressure. And well, I've seen shared psychosis more in a contained setting where I've worked, because I've worked in public sector settings, at state hospitals or in prisons where symptomatic individuals may go for a long period without being treated. So they're very severely ill. And when they form groups or with their co-conspirators, their street gangs, what happens is it's not the healthy individuals in the group that bring around the symptomatic individual, but actually the symptomatic person who spreads symptoms in a way that those who are emotionally bonded to the primary person, we call them the person with a primary illness, they come to look as if they had the primary illness themselves. Now, the way to treat these individuals is to take a careful history and figure out who started in terms of having symptoms. And
because
then
Bandy, you're talking about millions of people, possibly, right? That would
well,
be,
I'm talking about the specific groups that I've worked with, which happened to be, there was one family of 7. There was a whole gang. There was a prison block where I've seen this phenomenon happen, and it actually happens more commonly in these types of settings, where the entire group can take on even bizarre delusions. This family of 7 that I treated outside in the outskirts of Boston, the whole family actually believed that there were aliens who had come and inhabited all the bodies of their neighbors and friends. And so they barricaded themselves in their house, believing that the aliens would eventually reach them and take over their identities and bodies. And so now this is a whole family of 7. It's very unlikely.
This is a fascinating case. Bandy, can I just ask you, so did you clinically work with or somehow differentiate 1 or 2 members of the family that was the healthiest, quote unquote, and try to work with them? How did you work with these people? How did you help?
As I was saying, you have to take a careful history. You don't hospitalize them all. You only need to hospitalize the primary individual, the original person with the symptoms.
Oh, I see.
So even though all 7 looked like they had schizophrenia, and it was quite dramatic, once we hospitalized, in this case it was a mother, we hospitalized her, and within days you could see the difference. And within weeks, all of them returned to normal. None of the rest had schizophrenia.
Wow. But what I was referring to before is, as far as we can tell, Trump has a support of tens of millions of people.
Yes.
So I understand you're talking about this with an enclosed environment, family structure, or prisons or schools and so on. But are we talking about a mass phenomenon here, and that someone like a Mussolini and a Hitler and fascistic leaders can prey on, and which I think Trump fits into that sort of category. So how do you deal with perhaps literally tens of millions of people who are gravitating toward the message and the illness, if you will?
Well, the solution is actually quite simple.
Good.
As far as the shared psychosis is concerned, of course, when it has happened at this massive a level, and when it has spread, when it has been allowed to spread for so long, it would be much harder. But I know that the solution is rather simple, in that isolating the primary individual would take care of a lot of the irrational, fervent, uncontrollable spread of symptoms that we are seeing at this point. Of course, he's had a lot of imitators and a lot of, there are probably a lot of other individuals with primary illness who are spreading their symptoms as well. But as we have seen, once his influence is contained, the rest actually falls away rather quickly. We've seen it quite a number of times. We've seen it during the Black Lives Matter protests, when he actually went into a bunker and he hid for weeks at a time. And when he came out, he actually said, well, if I lose the election, I may have to concede. So he himself was actually responding to the fact that that he was not able to spread his symptoms as effectively, at least among those who are, for him, a very big threat. But in fact, it was an act of containment. We saw it with the COVID-19 pandemic when he also went into isolation, where some of his violent rhetoric, I would say, in terms of undermining the dangers of the disease and spreading of misinformation, going as far as drinking bleach and taking horseworm medication would take care of the illness. Many people died because of, I think something like 17,000 people died from ingesting ivermectin, and calls to the Poison Control Center went up dramatically once he mentioned bleach. And so this kind of this kind of emotional influence is much greater than we recognize. And most dramatically, when he was deplatformed from the social media platforms following the January 6th violent insurrection against the government, people actually turned around. There were many people condemning him. There were many of his followers regretted doing so, and it seemed at that time that people were coming to their senses. Now, most people believed it was because the act was so egregious, but for someone like myself who was observing the shared psychosis, it was the fact that he was deplatformed. It was simply from the removal of exposure. And we even saw it during his trial when he was not able to campaign for 5 weeks. For quite some time, his influence was diminishing. That's why all of a sudden he called for support, and Congress members, alarmingly, and so many of his supporters, including the Speaker himself, Mike Johnson, showed up in the courtroom to be of support to him. And
I think the next day after the court, he went to some I don't know, ultimate boxing, racing, wrestling sort of event in Jersey to gain back some of the macho-ness that he perhaps.
Right.
But what's so interesting here, Bandy, it sounds like that you're dealing with somebody, obviously a bully, that is holding on in a way for dear life, because he knows if the counter forces win, he's going to collapse. He's fighting for his own sense of mental health, whatever that may mean to him, which of course is very self-destructive. So he'll either go down in flames, but again, we're in a race for time here, because if he somehow gets into presidency, he, as I mentioned in the opening, he's got his colleagues setting up situations where it becomes very, very difficult to resist and fight back in legal ways and other ways. So this is dangerous stuff, right?
That is why I've urgently written my book, and my book has certain proposed solutions, which include mainly strengthening the psychology of the citizenry, because many of us are feeling rather defeated, of course, naturally, and frankly traumatized and immobilized because of this encounter with a phenomenon that the population is unfamiliar with. Of course, mental health experts are familiar with this, and which is why we felt that our education of the public was so important in the beginning, because prevention is much more powerful and effective than trying to get in after the fact. Right. I speak about the solutions in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. We are at the point of tertiary prevention, where any intervention will have to be dramatic, severe, and yet we don't know if it'll be effective or not because we did not intervene early enough.
You mean you're talking about the court and his court cases and possible imprisonment?
Even psychiatric hospiitalization, if need be. He has
Yeah,
met the criteria since.
and this would be involuntary, right? Involuntary, if you will, incarceration in a mental hospital. Is that would be the tertiary solution? Yeah.
Yes, well, you've read the chapter, obviously.
Yes, I have.
So,
Try to get through. Yes. So
the tertiary prevention is where you go in dramatically and place severe limit setting or accountability in this case, and you stop the spread of symptoms that way. You curtail the offender, the main instigator, because of the extreme influence of Donald Trump. It's not that the public will come on board and then we will find an intervention, but rather we almost have to intervene so that the public will be diminished in the irrational stoking from his own rhetoric and exposure, that they will be able to reason how this intervention has come about and the rationale for it, as well as how it will be protecting them.
And who would do that?
That's, of course, very difficult to do in a society driven by democracy.
And who would have the power to do that within our own political system?
We actually do, because we don't have a direct democracy, we have a republic. And in fact, it is intended to place a check on being able to involve those who have achieved the position of being representatives of the people, or their expert consultants or career servants of the government. But unfortunately, those are the very areas that have now been occupied by
but theoretically, perhaps
forces or those who have been infected by Trump contagion.
But let's say theoretically or not theoretically, someone like the ACLU would take the case and win. Would what, the Secret Service? Who would actually do the taking of him and putting him into some sort of facility?
Well, of course, that would be very difficult to do. Of course, he has met all criteria. It would be helpful if one of his treaters did it or one of his family members made an application. But for public health officials and for independent psychiatrists to do it, it, of course, has been very difficult, especially when we haven't been able to educate the public about these procedures. It is probably all right for me to announce that an eminent panel of psychiatrists have come together to give their pre-sentencing report to Judge Merkin and the New York District Court that is handling his sentencing. And so the first opportunity that we would have is incarceration. Now, mental health experts are routinely consulted on what the appropriate sentencing would be in taking the convicted criminal's dangerousness into consideration, because one of the goals of incarceration is isolation for public safety.
Right.
As well as deterrence, specific deterrence of the individual and general deterrence of the public. So we have made our recommendations. Now, this was unsolicited. We did it out of our duty to public health and public safety. So whether or not it's taken into consideration is up to the court. But
well, that would be the judge's if the judge somehow agreed with you, then that would be the next step. He would make the order.
That would be the most viable option at this time.
Right now, I see.
Because even though he's a first-time offender, we know that he has many other charges pending, very serious ones. We know that he has actually committed grave violence, some of the greatest forms of violence society has experienced. He has actually caused the deaths of more Americans than all the wars since the Civil War combined because of his COVID-19 mismanagement. He has also caused American democracy to be in peril by inciting a violent insurrection against the government itself. So, in fact, it would encompass sedition and treason. So all these things together, not to mention what he himself has said in his own words of his own dangerousness, in that he intends to dismantle American democracy and to create a violent and dangerous dictatorship where he will go against all his former enemies, real or imagined, and even execute them. And he's now currently seeking impunity were he to gain this position. So he is as dangerous a criminal as you can imagine. So even though the charges in the Manhattan District Court encompass only enough to give him a maximum of 4 years, we have recommended the maximum of 4 years.
Just to play devil's advocate here, in our political system, one can make the argument of so many presidents getting us involved in so many wars and misadventures. And again, the whole, we talked about structural violence, holding people accountable. I'm not necessarily disagreeing. You understand, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with what you just said, but also wouldn't the other side say, well, how do you define all of this? The president is the one that's making these decisions. He has advisors. We do have a republic and so on. He's not the only one, and so on and so on. So you're up against all kinds of political rhetoric and rationalizations here as well.
It is true that for criminal justice to work effectively, you have to have uniform application, and it has to have legitimacy in people's eyes. But one of the ways in which we gain and establish legitimacy is by applying the right norms and standards. The norms and standards that we already have. Fortunately, we have a long history and an immensely organized civilization that has carried this out for centuries, if not millennia. And so applying those principles, applying the norms and standards to Donald Trump's case, what about the other side, or what about other presidents, would not be the correct argument. In fact, it has been a problem that we have not applied these norms and standards in the past, which is why we have a truly egregious criminal come into the office, and they're able to gain traction when they speak of how others have not been persecuted in this way, as he will see it. But applying the right standards in this case, and perhaps it is about time that we hold other past presidents accountable, such as George W. Bush, or all his cabinet and war team that has effectuated what the rest of the world sees as war crimes. If they were prosecuted, yes, it would add to the legitimacy of the criminal justice system and our systems of security overall. Perhaps international law needs to be strengthened as well.
I was just going to say your work with the World Court and the International Criminal Court and so on, that needs, and movements around the world would have to be brought into this struggle as well. So this
Yes,
is a
absolutely.
monumental struggle of will here. What would you like to say to the followers of Donald Trump? They're all listening here right now. His staunchest allies.
I actually stopped speaking to Trump followers around 2019 or 2020 because that was about the point where I felt that they were they were conditioned beyond beyond my ability to reach. Before that, I spoke with them regularly. I actually called back and wrote back just about every Trump supporter who would reach out to me, and even formed some friendships. But following the 3 or 4 years that he was in office, there was a point where they were so conditioned that they would immediately, they would not be able to look beyond my gender, my race. I was a communist Chinese agent, and therefore a conversation was no longer possible. But this is not a situation that would resolve by talking alone. We have to address the source of this phenomenon coming to be in the first place. And as I said, first of all, the mechanism of spread is his exposure, the social media and media environment that is now actively spreading disinformation, in fact, preemptively spreading what he would have spread so as to curry his favor and to gain funding. It has become a whole system of propaganda and lies and even delusions that he would have spread, now being echoed and repeated by multiple media organizations. So first, that would be kind of a secondary intervention, if you will. And the primary intervention, getting at the source of all this, is to fix our socioeconomic system, and to fix the conditions of extreme inequalities that have brought people to this point of psychological fragility and vulnerability, that they would succumb to a shared psychosis. Socioeconomic inequality, which is a true crisis of this nation at this time, a global crisis actually, does not just have material effects. In fact, it's really the extreme gap between the rich and the poor that creates a kind of psychological vulnerability that allows for an immediate magnetic, almost chemical attraction to someone of Donald Trump's personality. And they form a kind of narcissistic symbiosis because it's based on developmental wounds, or in the part of the public, a regression from their state of development because of societal stress, which forms this immensely tight bond, a lock and key formation, if I were to borrow Dr. Gerald Post's terms, where the leader-follower relationship is almost inseparable. And it's within that context that they will transmit false beliefs, even delusions, violence proneness. They will have the same target enemies, and they will respond in emotional ways that have more to do with spread of symptoms than with rational persuasion or even informed consent. We have a situation where many people have succumbed to a condition that will forego their full mental capacities. And this has been done without informed consent. So
sounds like it's getting worse and worse.
Yes, that's right.
2 comments. As you know, we've tried to contact Reverend William Barber. It so happens that next week I'm doing a show with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who just finished the book it's entitled White Poverty with Reverend Barber. It seems like that's one of the people we absolutely need to have your message heard, and we ought to try and figure out ways of Jonathan at least hearing that, because this is a natural. This goes hand in hand with Barber's moral fusion and his whole campaign as well. And the other thing I just wonder, is there anybody in the national media at this point that one you could turn to that would have you on to discuss the book?
Well, as you know, since the American Psychiatric Association spread the disinformation that we were being unethical when we were speaking about Donald Trump and the dangers to public health he posed, of course, time should show that of the immense damage that has done. We were at one point the #1 topic of national conversation, and I was invited by all the major news media or programs and organizations, and I was interviewing 15 hours a day every single day. Now that was what the APA halted, and we've gotten unbelievable inundations of requests from the public asking, where are the psychiatrists, where are the psychologists? Now the public has become habituated to not having mental health experts on programs, and the news media act as if we don't exist. We're the only experts not allowed to speak about the area of our own expertise. Now, this is what happens in authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
First, that's why it was so important for us to speak up early on, and thousands of us came forth, as you know, and many were speaking in the media at that time, by the American Psychiatric Association making its own guild rule, which no other mental health association has, called the Goldwater Rule. It's become a household phrase, at least in the right wing, whenever the right-wing media, whenever they hear of a psychiatrist speaking up, they immediately discredit it, saying that they were violating the Goldwater Rule. Of course, only 6% of mental health experts are subject to that rule, and even those who broke it were not investigated or they were not sanctioned by the APA, even under their jurisdiction. So it can't be that important a rule if they don't act on it. And yet, publicly, they went on a public campaign to make this so-called rule, which is not really a rule, that not even psychiatrists knew about before the Trump era, and made it supersede all our other medical ethical obligations, including our obligation to society according to the core medical ethics. Our main ethics code has in its preamble that we have a responsibility to patients as well as to society. The Geneva Declaration, which obligates us to speak up when there's a humanitarian need, because especially under dangerous government, because that declaration came out of the experience of Nazism. So either collusion or silence were unacceptable according to its guidelines. And yet here we are. That's one of the reasons why I wrote my book. My Profile of a Nation was extremely popular, despite the fact that I didn't have a publisher then, and I won't have a publisher this time except through my own organization. And that too is quite phenomenal, because I'm a New York Times bestselling author, and numerous agents have approached me over time, and the publishers are afraid that the APA will come after them.
Amazing, amazing. Well, it sounds like you also got to work with the organized psychiatrists who still remain members. I know there's been a lot who left the organization, correct? So
there's been a huge exodus, yes, but enough members remain where they, they've gotten windfalls of federal funding,
Wonderful.
unprecedented in their history under the Trump administration. They were able to get a new building, a brand new building in the center of Washington. They're no longer in Arlington. And
well, listen, Bandy, you know, your mother probably told you this too. My mother's did the same. I mean, nobody said it was going to be easy, right?
We actually have it easier. This is the easiest it's going to get. You know, I taught students at Yale Law School representing political asylum seekers. And so we've seen all kinds of persecution come from these types of regimes. We still have it incredibly easy. What I've endured has nothing to do with seeing your entire family massacred before your eyes and you're being imprisoned for simply even imputed political views. And then you are gang raped if you're a woman, and you barely escape with your life to seek asylum in the United States if you're lucky. These were the kinds of cases we have seen. So this kind of obedience, this kind of preemptive obedience in advance, it's one of the actions that Timothy Snyder warned against, the historian who wrote on tyranny. His book came out at the same time as my book, and our books were side by side on bookshelves in the beginning. So this is exactly what we need to know about, and to not be afraid, because the other side is actually a paper tiger. It's a lot of bluster and a lot of defense mechanisms. Of course, this is exactly what dangerousness and violence are about. But we have to recognize that this comes out of weakness, not strength. And we need to strengthen our norms, standards, and our own grounding in our own emotional grounding, to be able to stand up for our principles and to stand up and act according to our conscience. This is especially the time when this is needed, and that is what my book is intended to strengthen.
Bandy, I couldn't put it any better. You were so articulate. You have the last word on this. Thank you so very, very much for being so courageous and standing up for this country, for our integrity, the love that you bring to the work and intelligence. Love you so very much. And we'll see you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for this book.